Hello, it's Gabby. Welcome to the Happier Life Project, brought to you by the free, award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. This is the podcast that explores what it means to live well in a messy, complex world. We've talked a lot on this pod about trying to grapple with the constant hamster wheel of life, where we're conditioned to strive for more, do more, be more, add more to our ever-growing list of achievements. But what if, instead of adding more, we started to embrace less? What if the key to living well isn't about doing more? It's about recognising our limits and finding peace in the life we already have. My guest today is the brilliant Oliver Burkeman, author of the Sunday Times bestsellers 4,000 Weeks and The Antidote, and his deeply reflective new book, Meditations for Mortals, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. For many years, Oliver wrote the much-loved Guardian column, This Column Will Change Your Life, and his thoughtful writing on productivity, mortality, the power of limits and building a meaningful life has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Psychologies, and New Philosopher. Oliver has garnered a devoted following for his wise, compassionate reflections on the human condition, especially around time, mortality, and the pressure to do it all. Rooted in the spirit of his beloved bi-weekly newsletter, The Imperfectionist, Oliver's Meditations for Mortals offers a 4-week retreat of the mind with daily wisdom, solace, inspiration and reflections designed to help us live with more clarity, calm and contentment in what Oliver himself calls an age of bewilderment. In this very episode of the Happier Life Project, Oliver and I talk all about the emotional toll of constant self-optimization, the impossibility of ever being truly on top of it all, and what actually happens when we let go of the exhausting fantasy of fixing life once and for all. I also ask Oliver about how we might befriend tasks we tend to avoid, something he thinks is a crucial part of living a more liberating life. We also talk a lot about acceptance and how embracing our limitations and making peace with uncertainty might just be the key to a saner, more meaningful life. So, ready to find a healthier, happier you? Let's get started. Welcome, Oliver Burkeman, to the Happier Life Project podcast. As I just mentioned to you previously, I do think we're quite aligned in terms of like the research and the content that we're putting out there in terms of striving towards a happier, healthier life and trying to quieten the mind a little bit from all the anxious thoughts and the anxious feelings. And I'd like to start by asking you, in your opinion, because you've been doing it longer than me, why do you think so many people do struggle with just this feeling of like, it's never enough?
I mean, yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I think there are lots of different layers to answering the question why. So I'll just be brief, but I think that this is partly a timeless human challenge, right? It's partly the fact that we are born into the world as finite animals like any other, except that we have this ability to dream of infinite things or feel more obligations than we could ever fulfill or beat ourselves up for not meeting standards that we could never meet. So there's a sort of built-in human thing. But then I think there is a lot going on with, culturally and economically in terms of the specific times in which we live, whether it's the fact that you're sort of exposed to so many very deceptive images of people who seem to be making it all work, whether it's just the fact that, digital technology connects us to so many more things we could be doing but are missing out on, or obligations we might feel, or terrible things happening around the world we might feel we have to make a difference to. So there's a real upping of that mismatch these days, I think, between our being limited
Yeah,
and the sort of infinite realm of things. Because there's no reason, there's no stopping place with like things you might feel you ought to be doing. That is an infinite list. But obviously there has to be a stopping place in terms of what you can actually do.
absolutely. Well, I'd just like to kind of add on to that. Do you think our ancestors were actually more content and fulfilled with what they had? I think about my grandparents, and they certainly didn't have everything, but I feel
Mm.
like they made the most of what they did have.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum because obviously, in many ways, our grandparents and certainly generations before that had it much, much worse. There's an old saying, I think it's Italian, that translates as "we were better off when things were worse."
Yeah.
And there's something kind of wise in that. I think partly it's to do with, yeah, it's to do with expectations, right? So both the expectations that are put on us today for being sort of incredibly hyper efficient workers and incredibly attentive parents and all the rest of it, those expectations have risen. But
Mm.
also, like, technology makes it feel like we ought to be able to manage this now because we can be so much more efficient and we can answer so many more messages and we can do. And if you go back to a time when those expectations just weren't baked into the culture, then yeah, I think people may have a much worse time in terms of quality of life, in terms of healthcare, in terms of women's rights, all sorts of very important things. But they don't torment themselves so much with this sense of like, I ought to be doing much more than I am doing, because that expectation just wasn't there. And if you go back much further than like our grandparents' generation, if you go back to like medieval times,
Right.
terrible lives in so many different ways, just an appalling existence for most people. And yet a real sense as well, I think, that like there was no point postponing life until you had felt in control of things like we do all the time
Yeah.
today, right? Because like plague, war, famine, anything could happen at any moment. So you sort of had to dive in anyway.
I think, I mean, this kind of weaves into your work and certainly the latest book that, I mean, obviously we weren't around back in medieval times, but like, depending on what you were born into, like where your ranking was, there was an element of acceptance. Whereas I think we don't have that quite now because it's like we are bombarded with those stories of like, oh, I used to be this, but then now
Mm.
I'm this, and you can achieve this too. And so we're sold this like we can always better our circumstances and have a better life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, obviously, it's double-sided, right? Because you don't necessarily at all want to go back to a time when people were told they should just know their place and stay in whatever unfair situation society and accidents of birth had landed them in.
Mm,
But yeah, if what you replace that with is a sense that wherever you are, it's never sufficient. And, this sort of classic finding from so much happiness research that you would just adapt to whatever you get. So it's so incredibly easy to become dissatisfied with any new achievement or status or income or anything that you achieve. Then that sort of endlessness, I think, is really a very specifically modern
mm.
kind of torment. Yeah.
Well, with all this happiness research that you've done, I was curious when I read your bio because it starts from like your time working at The Guardian and doing your column. So it always seems to be in this self-help space. And I mean, you can take me back further if it wasn't, but is this something that you always wanted to focus your career on?
Uh, I think the thing I really wanted to do from a very young age was to be a journalist, be a writer. And maybe subconsciously, I even then wanted to use it to sort of work out my issues. But that was what it turned into, right? I mean, there's a wonderful kind of excuse in a way in being a journalist, writing about stuff. You get to sort of encounter all sorts of topics that might be difficult to encounter otherwise, or that you might be embarrassed to encounter. I think that's a really interesting part of this for me in my
Mm,
background. It's like, well, I was only doing it for research, and then I was able to sort of use that as an alibi to basically do therapy in public, which I think is a big part of the work I do. And it's constantly amazing to me that, like, not only that I get to be allowed to do that, but that actually that really does seem helpful to other people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can relate to that totally because sometimes I feel with who I speak to on the podcast, if I'm not careful, it can go into a little bit of a therapy session. And then I have to just make sure this is relevant for everybody that's listening as well and our app users, and it doesn't
Yeah.
go too much down that route. But I did smile when I read the sort of setup of the first column was like, I'm going to do this until I've achieved happiness. And then if the dates are a bit wrong, please do correct me. But it was like September of 2020 where you were like, okay, I'm done now. And I thought, well, this is where most people in the world were definitely not happy. And I mean, it was tongue in cheek, wasn't it? Like, I'm sure when you wrote that in the beginning, you weren't thinking I am.
Oh, yes, to the point of being completely sarcastic. But I mean,
Yeah.
to pick up on what you're saying, I mean, I stopped writing that column because of all sorts of reasons. It was the right moment to do that, and it felt like the right thing to do to sort of keep being creatively fresh. But there is a sort of a real point hiding in there, I think, which is there is something very, it goes back to your acceptance point in a way. There is something about the goal here that is sort of like the idea is to see through the goal of happiness somehow. That actually what happens is that you become more okay with the ways in which you have not fixed yourself, in quotes, rather than finding the way to do it. And then this applies to all sorts of different areas of life, right? So it's like you can search for years for the right productivity system, and you can battle for years with your procrastination. Change will happen to the extent that it happens when you actually become more okay with how things are right now. So in a way, yeah, I was always joking about discovering the secret of human happiness, but
Yeah.
but it was an important transition for me to realize that actually being more and more okay with how things were was often the path to freeing them up and to changing things a bit.
Yeah. It was basically like, right, COVID's here, we're all buggered. So column done.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't that there was no point trying anymore, but it did have a sort of. There's something that I keep running into in my work, which is about how you do have to sort of accept a certain kind of defeat in order to sort of move through to the next level of doing things and feeling good about yourself and making a difference in the world. There is always that sort of encounter with, oh, okay, so it's when I realize I can't do everything that I can do a few things that matter. It's when I realize that I might always be a bit anxious or a bit prone to procrastination,
Right.
that I'm no longer so sort of oppressed by those things, and on and on and on, right? There's that kind of acceptance
Yeah.
piece, very important.
So then how do we walk that fine line between that acceptance versus the negative thoughts that most people expect the worst case scenario if like we are wired that way. Whereas like what you're saying makes complete sense of like being okay with what we can't control and whatever the outcome may be. But I do think it's quite hard to like find that right balance so you don't sort of tip into like, well, everything about my life is gonna be rubbish,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're really keying in there to what I would call the distinction between acceptance and resignation. And this is sort of endless debate in Buddhist circles and all sorts of other circles. But I think at its heart, what we're talking about when we talk about acceptance of the good kind is not acceptance that the way things are for you is right now is good or can't be changed or is just the way things are always going to have to be. Rather, it's acceptance of the fact that things really are as they are right now. And I think a lot of people, a lot of the time, without realizing it, it's very easy to fall into the sort of avoidance of the truth of your situation. It's very easy to think, well, okay, I feel overwhelmed by all the things on my to-do list this week, but I'm just going to keep pushing and I'm going to find a little bit more self-discipline than I've ever found before in my entire life to date and find the perfect system to do it. And then I'm going to be free of this problem. And that's actually a very sort of unaccepting attitude because it's sort of kidding yourself that.
And it's applies to like most people I know and probably myself too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This constant sense like I'm almost there. I've almost got on top of everything. Maybe it's just a few weeks or months away. And actually, I find, and I've written about this quite a bit now, like if you actually realize that, to put it facetiously, The situation's worse than you think. It's not that getting on top of your to-do list is incredibly hard. It's that getting on top of your to-do list really is essentially impossible. There's no end to the number of things that can come across onto your plate that need doing. And if you really sort of feel into that, and part of what I'm doing in my most recent book is trying to help people feel into that in a sort of stage-based way, it's not depressing at all, right? Because it actually stops being depressing once you realize that it's not incredibly grueling and awful, but just out of the question. Because at that point, there is this kind of amazing permission to just do a handful of things with your energy and your time today that feel like the most important things. And they might sometimes not be fun. You might have to do various sort of tedious chores that you wish you didn't have to, but you will no longer be living in that sort of provisional way of saying, well, okay, this is just for now. Real life's coming later.
Yeah.
And it's actually possible to sort of enter into life more fully then as a result.
I thought it was like a really good point, or it really kind of, hit home as a message for me, was when you said, because sometimes we do feel like we have to do everything, and you're like, you don't have to do anything, but you have to be prepared to bear the consequences of not doing that thing. And it makes you look at it a different way, I
think this is an incredibly useful insight. The person I'm quoting at that point in the book is a therapist called Sheldon Kopp, who said, you're free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences. And, I think at first glance, people get a bit annoyed by this because they think, well, are you saying that I have to do this job to feed my kids? I'm not going to let my children starve, or whatever it might be, right? Lots and lots of people, in fact, in some sense, all of us are in some situations that feel absolutely without choice. And I think the response to that very understandable criticism is like, on one level, to say, okay, fair enough for some things, but what about all the others? Like, how many things are you currently either doing in your life or failing to do in your life because you haven't quite got to the point of just being willing to deal with the consequences, right? So maybe pulling out of some activity that takes a lot of your time outside work will cause some people to be disappointed in you. But maybe that disappointment is a burden worth carrying because of what you'll be able to do as a result. So there are lots of contexts in life where we just haven't quite reconciled ourselves to the fact that, like, yeah, everything comes with a negative, everything comes with a downside. So sometimes you just have to pick the downsides. Yeah. And then secondly, if you want to go onto it in a really sort of existentialist philosophy way, in some theoretical sense, you don't have to feed your children. Now, if you actually would take that choice, probably something very, very wrong with you. And I'm not suggesting that anyone do that. I'm suggesting that when you see that you are choosing to do this thing, that in principle, like, a human being could choose not to do it, that actually gives the choice of doing it much more meaning, right? That makes you realize that, oh, okay, I'm not just actually like traipsing through my life doing things that I have to do. I'm doing something meaningful, which is I'm raising a family, or I'm keeping a roof over some people's heads. And, like, maybe I would like to have more choice about how I did that. And that's important. And none of this is a justification for our society being unfairly organized. But there is meaning in the stuff that we feel is non-negotiable in our lives, because clearly if it's non-negotiable, that's because on some level that it matters.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So then if we add another layer on top of that, and that's perfectionism, again, something that, like, a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah.
And we've done podcasts on it. I'm curious with you, because you called yourself at one point a productivity geek, which may or may not be the same as a perfectionist. I'm not exactly sure. But being a writer and a journalist, like, you want to put out there, in your eyes, the best work you can offer. Yeah. So, like, how do you make peace with overcoming that perfectionism urge, which I'd imagine you would have?
Oh, I definitely have it. One of the things I'm doing in the new book is sort of working with a broader definition of perfectionism than maybe is conventional. So definitely it includes, you always want to put out perfect work.
Yeah.
But I think it would also include a lot of people pleasing, right? You always want, you want to have perfect control over the emotions of everyone in your surroundings. I think imposter syndrome can be a form of perfectionism, right? You need to feel completely confident about what you're doing before you let yourself launch into it. And I'm really making the case that, like, it's not so much that perfectionism is an unhelpful and miserable way to live, like, which it is on some level. It's that perfection just doesn't belong to the world of human reality. Like our minds can always feel the need or the requirement to sort of get more done or get stuff done better or be a nicer person or whatever it might be than we can actually do with our finite time, energy, and attention. So in the writing case, yeah, like nothing I ever write is going to live up to the sort of vague but very perfectionistic standards I have for it in my head because it's in reality, and that's just how things work. And so I'm often trying to sort of encourage people to see that, in a sense, it's like it's already off the table, like that ship has sailed. One sort of slightly, hopefully humorous way of putting this I've used in the past is like it's not that you need to be worried that you might fail to be perfect in some way. It's that you've already failed. If the standard is perfectionism, all of us are just messing around in a state of failure. The great thing about that, there's a writer called Sasha Chapin who calls this playing in the ruins, right? You let these dreams sort of crumble and die a little bit, and then, oh, look, here we are in real life, and everyone's in the same boat, and all there is to do is sort of take a look at what's in front of us and see what interesting things we could create or useful differences we could make to people's lives or good relationships we could build in this state of already being completely imperfect to everything.
Well, you've got a once every fortnight your newsletter, Perfectionist, and there was a lot of inspiration, you said, from what you were writing and also the feedback that you were getting that has gone into the new book. I'd love to know your take on when it comes to applying this to our relationships as well, because sometimes we want the partner or the boss to be better, to do better. And that can cause a lot of anxiety as well. And I just wonder, applying it to others in terms of making peace with the fact that they aren't perfect, they're not going to live up to what I would want them to deliver in terms of fulfilling me in XYZ kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely relationships are of all kinds are at the core of this, aren't they? Because, I mean, what I'm really talking about throughout the book is the limits to our control over our world. And I'm also making the case, we can talk about it if you like, that actually we wouldn't want to achieve the kind of control we think we need over our world. This will be very bad. And the more control we get in some ways, the worse life feels. We talk about that. But obviously a big part of that reality that we live in is other people. And I think very naturally, we all of us fall into ways of trying to control them more than we ever really can. And obviously in some very, very awful cases, that's a very overt kind of abusive control. But in its own sort of slightly shy and retiring way, just being a people pleaser is an attempt to manipulate people in a certain way, even if you're doing it out of, you're not aware of any sort of negative ideas like that. Lots of parenting advice, even if it's the right parenting advice sometimes, basically has this idea of like, do this, and then you will exert more control over your children. And at the end of the day, and I'm still learning this myself, right? But at the end of the day, there's always more vibrancy and enjoyability in relationships and usefulness in work relationships when you can somewhat let go of that need to control people and sort of let them do their own work in the world and be themselves. It reliably leads to better results, whatever you want to say the results of a relationship is.
Yeah, it can just cause, again, so much angst and turmoil, I think, when you're trying to control something and the outcome relies on somebody else, the partner or the boss or, the child. Like, they've got their own thing. They've got their own agenda. They've got their own thoughts and feelings. And it might be fine.
Alfred Adler, who you might be very familiar with, the great, one of the sort of co-founders of modern psychotherapy in a way, had this concept of the separation of tasks, and it crops up in lots of different other writings as well, right? This idea that like there are tasks that are your tasks in life, and then there are tasks that are other people's tasks, and sort of how other people feel about things and whether they are able to step up to certain situations is their task, and it's not your task. Now, your task, if things got really bad, might be to leave a relationship. Your task might be to leave a job or to fire someone if you are in that position. Sometimes that is your task, but your task is not, and never can be, to sort of control the daily movements or feelings or words of another person. I think that's really useful.
Yeah. But I would also add on to that from reading your material that maybe it is time to leave. But actually, I think people are a bit quick to do that now too. And it feeds into what we're projected as the perfect partner or the perfect job. And actually, if we accept that, okay, that person is a bit flawed, but there's still a lot of good. If I kind of accept that I'm not going to get the amount of time I want from them, or I'm not going to get that promotion at least for the next year, but maybe that's okay, rather than being like, I'm just going to discard it, you know?
I'm glad that you raised it. I think it's a really good point. I think, something that I keep coming back to and sort of having to relearn for myself as well is that, like, there's almost never one choice that is going to be the meaningful and right one for pretty much everyone. So, right, the classic example would be leaving a relationship. Sometimes that is the brave and bold and self-compassionate choice. But sometimes, in a different set of circumstances, the bold and self-compassionate choice is staying and being willing to stay. And so this is where this question that I've written about from James Hollis, the Jungian psychotherapist, he recommends asking yourself about choices like that. Does this choice I'm considering making, does it enlarge me or diminish me? And it doesn't work for everybody, but for a lot of people, this has a kind of, it connects to something intuitive, right? Because actually, there are the kinds of difficulties you encounter in a relationship or a job or something like this that are the kind that really are red flags that you need to get out, and that it's going nowhere, and that it's going to sort of diminish you as a person on and on and on if you stay. And then there are the kind of difficulties that are actually just like part of growing and maturing as a person. And yeah, looking back at my own sort of more younger adulthood, I was definitely on the side of being too scared of committing to things rather than being too ready to commit to things. And so running away at the first difficulty was definitely the danger that I was prone to, rather than kind of throwing myself, getting married at 20 without thinking about it or anything, right? And so it depends where you are in that, understanding for yourself what the kind of choices that involves pushing yourself a bit, involves a bit of discomfort, but isn't just self-punishment, right? Like remaining in a really abusive situation or something would be.
Yeah, absolutely. You draw on so much information from different people, and I'd love to pick up on something again in the book about, and I hope I pronounced this right, the Zen master Gyokenet.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The goal in her teaching style wasn't to lighten the burden of the student, but to make it so heavy that he or she would put it down, basically meaning what we've talked about. You can't do everything. But then I was sort of, meditating on that thought of, like, to get to that point, do we have to become so burdened that we're like, have a meltdown and drop all the spinning plates? Yeah, I don't know. What were your thoughts on this?
I mean, I love this phrase. So yeah, just to repeat it, she said that her goal in teaching students wasn't to lighten their burdens, but to make the burden so heavy that he or she would put it down. You can interpret this in lots of ways, and I don't think you need to interpret it in the idea of like you've got to hit rock bottom before anything will change. There's a long tradition of that approach, and it's been very helpful.
Negative thoughts going straight to the default.
Right, yeah. And the sort of idea of hitting rock bottom has been very helpful to a lot of people in sort of 12-step philosophies of change and recovery and all the rest of it. The sort of meaning that Zen idea has for me, it's almost like a perspective shift. So the burden becoming heavier is more like when you realize how heavy the burden already is. So when you realize that you've spent the last X number of years of your life trying to get on top of a number of obligations and roles and tasks that it was never going to be possible for you to get on top of, when you realize that you've been sort of desperately trying to fix yourself in certain ways that actually maybe you never needed fixing. What you needed was to be a bit kinder to yourself. Or imposter syndrome, another good example, right? When you realize that instead of waiting for the time when you feel as confident as everyone around you, you suddenly realize that like, oh, everyone's winging it. They're just better at hiding it, but we're all just sort of improvising our way through life. And in that moment, when you go from like, this is really difficult to, oh, this is just impossibly heavy, I think that is one sense of that phrase in which there's this sort of moment of release, not necessarily a sudden transformation. I think those tend to be a bit overrated, but a beginning of seeing like, oh, all right, I've been trying for various psychological reasons to do something that wasn't possible or necessary and doesn't actually help all the people I think it's going to help and doesn't make me happier. So I think in that transition, there's a lot of power. In Zen, they often talk about like the way we treat life as a problem to be solved. And actually, the cause of suffering is not that we haven't found the solution to it yet. The cause of suffering is that we think it's a problem that ought to be solved instead of just an experience to be lived. So again, it's this like constant straining to kind of lighten the burden, get to the point where you're finally free of things. And it's like, oh, actually, I can be free just by putting down that expectation.
Well, I'd love to know your take on, because mental health, as you know yourself, has become somewhat of a buzzword over. I don't know if it was COVID which really kicked it all off, but it suddenly became everywhere. Every personality under the sun was talking about their mental health struggles. Influencers who probably actually aren't qualified or on social media saying, follow my program and you're a happier, healthier life. And there's all this stuff. And us coming from a background of like clinically certified, you know, we always have to be a bit more careful.
Yeah.
It's even though it's like, well, we're trying to take on a program that's supposed to help us feel better. A lot of it is setting you up for more failure, isn't it? I would say, in my experience, it's like either it's too big and too daunting and you can't complete it, so you beat yourself up, or you do whatever is suggested, you feel no different, and then you beat yourself up again.
Yeah.
And for you working in this space for a lot longer, and certainly before it became such a, I'm even going to say overused sometimes word, or used in the wrong context. Just where you're at with all of that, I'd love to know.
Yeah, I mean, I stress once again that I do not have qualifications except sort of being human and thinking about this stuff a lot and reading and talking to people, but I'm not coming at it from a mental health qualification. I think that, you know, it's this extraordinary duality where it's so good and important that we no longer have to so much anyway pretend that anxiety and moments of despair and all sorts of psychological struggles aren't just completely, you know, ubiquitous. Everyone has some encounter with those at different levels. I think that is an incredibly good thing. There are clearly all sorts of contexts where there's something not right about the relationship that we have to sort of mental health diagnoses. Either the idea of sort of forming your identity around a diagnosis in such a way that might make it quite hard to change because you're on some deep level getting a sense of identity from it. Exactly. Or, you know, there are certainly isolated examples, aren't there, of people sort of using it as a kind of an excuse for certain behavior or ways of being in the world. I don't think that's necessarily that widespread. I mean, I guess where I come down on all this is I think it's so important to be able to talk about the suffering side of being human, and it's so helpful in terms of alleviating that suffering. I'm a lot warier of sort of dipping my own toes or writing my own focus of writing, you know, into sort of diagnoses. Sometimes people are asking me to write about ADHD or something, saying that some of what I write seems very relevant to people with an ADHD diagnosis. And I'm like, that's great. It's wonderful if it's helpful. But I really want to keep the focus on sort of universal human suffering. And that gets a bit complicated when you start to talk about diagnoses, because either diagnoses like that, disorders, are not universal or near universal,
Yeah.
because that's what a disorder just means, right? In some sense, it's unusual or abnormal, or it just loses its meaning. And if we're just talking about the anxiety of being alive, for example,
Yeah.
that's a really important topic, but we don't need to talk about having an anxiety disorder in that context. That's called being human. So,
Yeah. Well, this is what I think is really great about your work and definitely like, reading the latest book is that it's exactly what you're saying. It's that like these are the issues that we all struggle with. So we don't need to start labeling ourselves as I've got depression, I've got OCD, I've got whatever. I mean, I think it's just like to honor the people that actually do have a genuine mental health illness, and that can be really debilitating. But then it's just this kind of saturation of it becoming almost lifestyle content now. But I think, yeah, it's really good that you are addressing that actually, like, sometimes we are going to feel terrible, but it doesn't necessarily mean we should
yeah,
have antidepressants.
no, absolutely. And it's so difficult because obviously there are people who are hugely liberated by a diagnosis, right? It's like, okay, now I understand what's going on and I can get on with building a meaningful life more energetically. And you definitely see those
Yeah.
encounters, those experiences. I mean, at the end of the day, this is getting too sort of social theory, probably for much of a good conversation, but at the end of the day, mental illnesses and mental health disorders are socially constructed. That doesn't mean they're not real, but it means that where we draw boundaries between, just being human and having an anxiety disorder, for example, is kind of done by us as a society. It's not written into our neurons, or on some level, it's a question of agreeing that certain kinds of behavior or thinking are disorders and the rest are being human. And I guess I just stay more on the side of being human, but it doesn't mean there's no reality on the other side of that boundary.
Not fearing the future. How do we prepare to embrace no matter what lies ahead, do you think? Does it go back to acceptance?
Well, it does. And it goes back to the same kind of acceptance that I'm always sort of pushing here, which is not make yourself be okay with how uncertain the world feels and how uncertain each of our futures is, but just sort of see what is already true, which is that we have no ability as humans to have any more than a sort of probabilistic sense of what's coming in the future. We can't control the future, no amount of planning or worrying, even though actually what we seem to be trying to do when we do that is exert a kind of grip on the future. None of it's ever going to do that because the future is in the future. So again, it's not sort of punching people in the face and saying like, or slapping people in the face and saying like, you've got to become better at embracing uncertainty. It's like, actually, you're already in an uncertain position and you've been in an uncertain position your whole life to this point. And yet, here you are. And all you did was cross every bridge as you came to it. All you did was exist in a sequence of present moments. Doesn't mean you didn't make some sensible or unwise decisions that affected your future. People can do that, but you've always thrived to whatever extent you've already thrived in your life at all. You've done it under conditions of total uncertainty. And this point applies to the world at large as well, right? It's like we feel very anxious, like anything, terrible things are happening or could happen at the level of politics, level of climate, and lots of very serious crises.
Yeah, and they are happening.
And they are happening. But the idea that humans have previously not had to contend with this level of uncertainty, but now we do, is really not an accurate statement of where we are. So I think there's a kind of strange sort of bittersweet comfort in the idea that it's like, yeah, welcome to being human. Again, doesn't mean you don't do things to try to fight and make a difference in those crises, but it means that you stop demanding that you first of all feel really certain about what's going on before you can take action.
I'd really love to squeeze in, actually, when we're talking about doing things that we don't like, are you encouraged to try and find some joy in it? I think you're talking about like procrastination in particular. Could you elaborate on that slightly in terms of like the parts of life we maybe try and avoid, like how we can just embrace them, I think is what you were saying?
There's a couple of different bits of the book. So, I mean, on one hand, when you talk about tasks you want to avoid, you're sort of talking about boring stuff that we wish we didn't have to do. And then the other kind is like scary stuff that we're trying to quite put a lot of effort into not thinking about or not addressing. In the first case, I think, there is definitely the possibility of being more fully present with what we're doing. A lot of the time, that feeling of disliking a chore is really a sort of a non-acceptance of the present. It's a feeling like that there's a better place you could be, that it's really problematic that you have to be doing this in the first place. And again, as I've been saying, like, this is not to suggest that housework is fairly distributed in our society in 2025, but once you are the person who is doing chore X, there is a choice between whether you sort of give yourself to the experience or whether you do it in this sort of constant holding back from the experience way. And the latter is, and there's lots of research about this as well, like the latter is much more associated with making yourself miserable, right? And the more that you're sort of feeling and entering into the experience, the more it stops mattering whether the experience was one that you sort of particularly relished in advance or not. When it comes to the things we avoid because we're scared of them, you know, this way that like if you've got some pain in your stomach, you might avoid going to the doctor in case it was something serious, or if you've worried that you've not got as much money in your bank account as you thought, you avoid checking the balance when you go to a cash machine. I mean, this is a really sort of ironic human behavior because obviously the right thing to do about a pain is to get it checked out. And if you do need to take control of your finances, you better start by knowing how much is in the bank account. There's a whole section on that in the book. I won't go into it in detail now, but there again, it really is a question of just sort of incrementally coming to understand that this thing is already in your life. So it might be a question of like just visualizing yourself going to the cash point and checking your balance, just doing something to interrupt that constant mental process of like shutting out, which is an active process, right? We put energy into not thinking about things. Anything you do to sort of let it back in begins the process through which you can say, okay, this is part of my reality. I will go and check my bank balance. And, you know, what I find there won't kill me. And it will put me in the position that I can take the next step. And nothing is a better antidote to anxiety and sadness and all the rest of it than action when you can gently encourage yourself to take it.
Yeah. And acceptance, going back to acceptance again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, acceptance of what already is, not resigning yourself to the idea that this is how things have always got to be.
I could talk to you for so much longer, but I'll be very respectful of your time. Thank you so much for today. There is one final thing that I do, and it's called the Happier Life Project's Last 5 in 5. It's the 5 questions that I ask every guest to conclude the episode.
I'll do my best.
Okay. I think you're going to nail this. When and where are you at your happiest?
Out in the moors around where we live here now is the place that springs immediately to mind, in big, bleak natural landscapes.
What's your favorite thing to do that nourishes your mental health?
Well, there is that hiking. I think that journaling is, it's a bit of a cliche, but really important for me. I write sort of morning pages, try to cover 3 sides of a narrow ruled notebook each morning. And I'm quite a lot crankier to deal with, I think, if I don't get that opportunity.
What piece of advice do you now know that you wished somebody would have told you earlier that would have made you a happier person?
So many, but I will go for how actually it's not only okay, but almost an important skill, I think, to be able to disappoint people, to be able to sort of take actions, do things that feel like the right thing for you to do, even if there's a risk that somebody is going to judge you for it. This is very, very liberating thing to be able to do, to not go around with a mortal fear of disappointing other people.
What is the most important one thing that needs to change to make the world a happier place?
I think that if all of us, and I definitely include myself, could be a little more adept at sort of feeling the full set of feelings that are encompassed with about being here in the moment, feeling our anxieties and sadnesses and all the rest of it, being willing to be with and keep those things company instead of always trying to sort of push them away or find ways to make them go away. I think that the world will be a much better place. I think, especially if you look at sort of the worst actors in the international sphere, in politics and elsewhere, and you think to yourself, like, what is it actually like to be that person? Or what are they trying to deal with inside? It's often a sort of externalization of an unwillingness to just sort of really fully feel the lows as well as the highs of human experience.
And finally, what is a simple, actionable first step we can take when it comes to embracing our limitations and an imperfect life that will help us on our mission to building a happier life?
I think the temptation there is for me to suggest a practice, right? It's like, do this thing every day or take up this particular way of doing things. What I really want to say is that the answer is, and I'm picking the number arbitrarily, of course, but it's like 10 real minutes of anything that you know makes you feel more alive. 10 real minutes of reaching out to a friend you're out of touch with, or being in nature, or doing a creative practice. Not 10 minutes every day. That's a whole big story for later, whether you're actually going to come back and do it again and again. But just like right now or in the next 24 hours, 10 actual minutes, not thinking about it, planning it, getting the equipment for it, but just like allowing yourself to do one of those things that you actually already know fills you with a feeling of being more fully alive.
Amazing stuff. Thank you so much. Meditations for Mortals, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts, is out now. In terms of pointing to your work, is the best place your website, oliverburkeman.com?
Yeah, books, wherever you buy books and audiobooks, and then the website for the newsletter and other stuff. Yeah. Yes,
you can sign up for the newsletter. And then on the social media, I don't know if you're doing much there. You've got a Twitter, Twitter now X.
I really pulled back from social media, and now I'm making tentative steps back on.
Okay. Well, we'll put all the links in the episode show notes. Oliver, thank you so much for today. It's been really fascinating. And it's so nice actually to get somebody else that works in this field take on, what they've learned along the way.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
It's Gabby back with you. Huge thanks again to Oliver Burkeman, and a big thank you to you, my friend, for listening to this episode of the Happier Life Project podcast. As always, just one more minute of your precious time, please, before I sign off, to run through the important housekeeping. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you are in crisis or you think you may have an emergency, please do call your doctor or the emergency services immediately. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the interviewer, which is me, and the interviewees. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a substitute for professional or medical advice. Our partners at the Priory Healthcare are not involved in the production or content of this podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please do subscribe if you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, and leave a review if you haven't already. Thanks to everybody who has. And to find and follow us on social media if you're not already there. We are at My Possible Self, and I've been at Radio Gabby. Do take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.